All right, here's the next argument to support it. I hope this, by the way, the camera is still focused right, because I accidentally kicked it, and my camera person, my wife, I don't make her stick around for these things. She goes in, once she sets it all up, she goes into the house, and I stay out of the studio, so I don't have a way to check and see if it's okay. Hopefully it is. There's no clear way to resolve disagreements about morality. I mean, think about when you and I might disagree on what's right and wrong. You know, we can argue a little bit, but then once we'll finally get to this point where we're just like, no, these kinds of things are just wrong. Oh, you shouldn't do this. Yes, you should, right? We can't argue about our objective moralities without actually assuming our own moralities, right? We can't go to other cultures and we can say like, hey, that's wrong, without just assuming that what we're saying is right. So it seems like we can never really resolve these things. We're all starting from our own perspectives, and where do we go from there? So it seems like you would have to agree to a cultural relativism. Here's an objection to that argument. It seems factually wrong, right? It seems like we do have the ability to step back from our culture and say, no, I don't agree with the way our culture is going. So, for example, Martin Luther King Jr. Systematically rejected what his culture was saying was right. William Wilberforce, who was instrumental in getting slavery abolished in England, was considered an awful person for doing that by many people when he first started. He was such a weirdo, right? He was so far out there, and yet, after years and years, he finally changed the culture, but he had to change first. So it does seem like we can step apart from our culture and have our own thoughts about those kinds of things. And it also seems like there are ways that we can appeal to open-minded people. Now, those are arguments that will eventually be discussed. When we're talking about different kinds of systems of ethics, I'll show you some more as we go along here. But here's an example. I used to think that European topless beaches were wrong. Like, if you see by the way, if you don't know what I'm talking about, watch the original version, the original episode of Cultural Relativism, because that's not just some random thing I'm throwing out there. Yeah, I used to think it was wrong, and then I thought a lot more about it, and about how in St. Clemente I'm always shirtless almost, and that doesn't seem like a big deal, and yet in other places that it is a big deal. And I reasoned through those things. I might be wrong about that. I don't know, but it seems like at least that I can think about it, right? And I can step back and say, no, my culture might say that it's wrong, but I can kind of see why somebody would say that it's not wrong. And finally, just because we can't resolve the truth of these things doesn't mean that they aren't true or false. There are lots of, in fact, the majority of propositions that you can express are not resolvable, whether they're true or false, and yet will be true or false. If I were to say, it rained on this spot 500 years ago today, now that's either true or false, right? But there's no way for me to actually prove that to you, or for you to prove it, that I'm wrong or anything like that. Most statements are like that, right? It rained 499 years ago on this very spot. How do you prove? You can imagine how many statements you can make like that, and most of them are going to be statements that you can't prove one way or another. And yet, it seems like there will be a true or a false to that. So in the same way, we might make claims about morality and say it is wrong to do X, to own slaves or something like that. And even if we argue, even if we can't come to an agreement, there seems like it would be easy for it to be either true or false.